Hello. Would you describe yourself as a law-abiding citizen? When you were at school, were you someone who naturally stuck to the rules, or did you see how far you could push things? I remember once seeing a small child at a community cricket match who was told that they must not go past the boundary rope. The little one shuffled their feet up to the rope so that they were touching it, and then they tried to move it forward without actually stepping over it. They were literally pushing the boundaries. And even if we do try to stick to the rules, sometimes we make mistakes and accidentally break them, don't we? I must admit, I was driving the other day and I looked down at the speedometer and realised that my speed had crept up a few miles above the legal limit. Our reading from Romans today talks about Abraham, seen as the father of the Jewish faith. He was seen as a godly man, despite a number of quite significant mistakes in his life. And we're told that his righteousness, his being right with God, his being a godly person, wasn't down to him keeping all the laws, but because of his faith, because of his trust in God, a trust that we know wobbled at times. He wasn't perfect, because as the passage tells us, none of us are. Paul was explaining to the Roman Christians that none of us will ever be able to fully keep the laws of God because we're imperfect. But because of Jesus' death, we can be forgiven and seen as righteous before God. It isn't that what we do doesn't matter. It does. Our sinful actions, breaking the law, breaking the rules, has consequences, sometimes really awful ones. But despite all of that, through God's grace, we can be all right with God. What makes us right with God is our faith, our acceptance that we do sin, but that we are forgiven and right with God because of Jesus' death and resurrection. Having the humility to recognise that even when we might try not to, we are inevitably going to mess things up. And of course, there are the times when we deliberately choose to do what we know is wrong as well. What we do does matter, but the important thing in terms of our righteousness, in terms of being right with God, is our faith and recognition of what Jesus did. And our reading from Matthew's Gospels today reinforces all of that through two short stories about three different people that Jesus encountered during his ministry. Firstly, we have him meeting Matthew, the tax collector, and calling him to follow him. Matthew follows, and it ends up with Jesus having dinner at Matthew's house, and then being joined by lots of other tax collectors and sinners. Now, in the Jewish community at Jesus' time, tax collectors weren't just seen as annoying people who took some of the money that you'd earned. They were a hated group. They were traitors for working for the Roman occupying forces. And they extorted and cheated people out of money far beyond what they needed to pay in taxes to the Romans. For Jesus, as a rabbi, to have engaged with a tax collector positively would in itself have been seen as a scandal. But to have then chosen to socialise with Matthew, other tax collectors and sinners, was unthinkable. But Jesus challenged the Pharisees, who challenged him by pointing out that he came for the benefit of those who sin, not for the righteous. I think there are a couple of ways we can think about that comment from Jesus. He could have been meaning two different things, and maybe he was meaning both of them at the same time. If Jesus came for the sinners, then Jesus came for all of us because none of us is righteous. Because, as we've already heard, none of us managed to keep all the laws all the time. But I also wonder if Jesus was pointing out to the Pharisees that their own self-righteousness, their own sense of pride in managing to keep most of the laws, most of the rules, many of which, I would hasten to add, they had made up in the first place. It was their self-righteousness that was stopping them accepting the gift of mercy and grace that Jesus was offering. Those who recognised their imperfections as the tax collector and sinners did, they were able to receive that gift of grace from Jesus. And then we have the account of the synagogue leader's dead daughter and the woman who was bleeding. Now, both the synagogue leader and the woman recognised that Jesus had something to offer them. They both had faith that Jesus could change their lives. And both were asking Jesus to break religious laws. Dead bodies and menstruating bodies were both seen as unclean at that time, as impure, and they would have been seen to contaminate the holy rabbi. By Jesus being in the presence of a dead body or being touched by the bleeding woman, he would have been made unclean by association, by contamination. But their faith in Jesus meant that they knew it was worth it. They knew, or at least hoped, that Jesus would have mercy on them, as he had very recently spoke about in his challenge to the Pharisees. They were both desperate enough to risk their pride and to put this to the test. There is nothing to suggest that either the woman, nor the synagogue leader, nor his daughter had done anything particularly sinful, recognising that they, like all of us, would have, of course, sinned. There was nothing to suggest that the girl's death or the woman's illness was a punishment for sin. Yet the society they lived in still saw them as unclean and therefore definitely unworthy of contact with Jesus. But Jesus ignored those rules and engaged with them, allowed himself to be touched by them or to touch them, and in doing so offered that grace, mercy, and ultimately healing that they both longed for. Now, both of these stories from Matthew show us that none of us are beyond the bounds of God's love, mercy, and grace. Whether we might feel we or society or individuals, whether we might feel that we're unworthy, or whether society or individuals might judge us to be too bad or sinful to be worthy of God's love. We are not. God's grace and mercy, our grace and mercy, exactly because we can't earn them from our own efforts, but by accepting them as gifts. Our readings today challenge us to remember that we can't be right with God through our own efforts. Our righteousness is God's gift to us through Jesus. So if you're feeling like you're not good enough, remember that you are, because of Jesus. The readings also challenge us, though, to be humble, not to judge others. We do not get to decide who is worthy of God's love. We don't get to decide who is included as righteous. And actually, when we do, I think that removes us further from God. May we learn what it means to live out what Jesus said, quoting the words of the prophet Hosea. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. May we sacrifice our own self-righteousness, and may we recognise the mercy that has been offered to us, and then extend it to others as it has been offered to us. Amen.